The security cameras at the Green estate captured everything that Tuesday evening at 6:47 p.m. What they recorded would forever change the life of one of America's most powerful tech moguls, his two children, and a woman whose simple act of kindness would shatter walls that money could never break down. But to understand why billionaire Javi Green found himself crying in his marble-floored hallway that night, you need to know how a man who built an empire on algorithms and data had somehow lost the ability to connect with the two people who mattered most in the world. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Javi Green hadn't planned on becoming America's youngest tech billionaire by age 32. Like most overnight successes that took 15 years to achieve, his journey from a scholarship kid at MIT to the founder of NexTech Solutions had been paved with 18-hour workdays, countless failures, and an obsessive drive that his late wife Sarah used to tease him about. "You're going to work yourself into an early grave, Javi," she'd say, stealing his laptop during dinner. "The world's problems will still be there tomorrow." That was before the twins arrived. Before Sarah's unexpected complications during delivery. Before everything changed in ways no amount of money or technology could fix. Now, 3 years later, Javi stood in his corner office on the 42nd floor of the NexTech Tower in downtown Seattle, staring out at the city skyline without really seeing it. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd revolutionized how the world communicated through his innovative software platforms, yet he couldn't figure out how to talk to his own children. Emma and Ethan Green were 5 years old now, and both had been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder when they were 3. The specialists used words like nonverbal, sensory processing challenges, and highly routine dependent. What they meant, in terms Javi understood all too well, was that his children lived in a world he couldn't access, no matter how many experts he hired or how much money he threw at the problem. His executive assistant, Patricia Chen, knocked on the glass door. "Mr. Green, I have the profiles from the agency." Javi turned from the window, straightening his tie. This would be the 7th nanny in 18 months. The previous 6 had all quit for various reasons. The twins' unpredictable meltdowns, their refusal to engage with structured activities, or simply the overwhelming nature of caring for 2 children whose needs seemed impossible to meet. "Send them in," he said. Settling behind his mahogany desk, the woman who entered didn't look like the others. Where previous candidates had worn crisp business attire and carried impressive portfolios, this woman wore simple jeans, a soft cardigan, and carried nothing but a small purse. She was in her mid-40s, with graying brown hair pulled back in a casual ponytail, and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Green, I'm Rosa Martinez. Thank you for considering me for the position." Javi glanced at Patricia, who simply nodded and left them alone. "Please sit. I have to be honest, Ms. Martinez, your resume is quite different from what we usually see for this role." Rosa settled into the leather chair across from his desk. "You mean because I don't have formal childcare certifications or a degree in early childhood development?" "Well, yes. Your background shows 15 years as a public librarian in various schools, and before that you were a reading specialist. No offense, but caring for children with special needs requires specific training." "You're absolutely right," Rosa said, her voice calm but confident. "I don't have those certifications, but I do have something else. I understand what it's like to feel like you're speaking a different language than everyone around you." Javi frowned. "I'm not sure I follow. My younger brother Miguel was autistic. This was back in the 80s, when most people didn't even know what that meant. My parents worked 3 jobs between them just to keep food on the table, so I became his primary caregiver when I was 12 years old." Rosa's eyes grew distant. "Miguel never spoke a single word out loud his entire life, but he communicated in dozens of other ways. Once I learned how to listen." Something in her tone made Javi lean forward. "What do you mean?" Miguel would arrange his toy cars in specific patterns to show me how his day went. A straight line meant he was happy. Circles meant he was anxious. Zigzag patterns meant he was overstimulated. He'd stack blocks to different heights to indicate what he wanted for breakfast. He had an entire language. I just had to learn to speak it. Javi felt something stir in his chest, an emotion he'd buried under spreadsheets and board meetings. What happened to Miguel? He passed away 5 years ago from a heart condition. But those 23 years I spent as his sister and caregiver taught me something most people with degrees don't understand, sometimes the most profound. Communication happens in silence. The interview continued for another 30 minutes, but Javi had made his decision within the first 5. When Rosa left, he immediately called the agency to confirm her employment, bypassing his usual process of checking references and conducting background investigations. 2 days later, Rosa Martinez arrived at the Green Estate in Bellevue at exactly 7 a.m. The house itself was a testament to Javi's success, a sprawling 12,000-square-foot modern masterpiece with floor-to-ceiling windows, an infinity pool, and smart home technology that could be controlled from anywhere in the world. But for all its technological marvels, it felt more like a museum than a home. Javi met Rosa at the front door, still adjusting his cufflinks. "Ms. Martinez, welcome. I should warn you, the twins haven't had the easiest adjustment to new caregivers." "That's understandable," Rosa said, setting down a large, worn canvas bag by the entrance. "Change is difficult for anyone, but especially for children who find comfort in predictability." Javi led her through the marble-floored foyer, past abstract art worth more than most people's houses, toward the west wing where the children's rooms were located. Their routine is very specific. Emma wakes up at 6:30, Ethan at 6:45. Breakfast is always the same. Emma eats only rectangular foods cut into precise squares. Ethan only eats things that are orange or white. They have therapy sessions 3 times a week, and their afternoon schedule is blocked out in 15-minute intervals. "What do they do for fun?" Rosa asked. The question caught Javi off guard. "Fun? Well, they have educational toys, tablets with learning applications. Emma likes to sort things by color and size. Ethan enjoys spinning objects. But what makes them laugh? What brings them joy?" Javi stopped walking. In 3 years of raising his children, no one had ever asked him that question. Not the therapist, not the previous nannies, not even himself. I'm not sure they experience joy the same way other children do." Rosa's expression softened. "Mr. Green, may I ask you something? When you were 5 years old, what made you happiest?" "Building things with my hands. My dad was a mechanic, and I used to help him in the garage. I'd spend hours taking apart old radios and trying to put them back together." A rare smile crossed Javi's face. "I probably broke more than I fixed, but he never got upset. He'd just hand me another broken appliance and say, 'Let's see what this one can teach us.' And you felt understood in those moments. Safe to explore and make mistakes." "Yes." The word came out as barely a whisper. They reached the twins' playroom, where Emma and Ethan sat on opposite sides of the large space. Emma was methodically arranging colored blocks in perfect rows, while Ethan spun a small top over and over again, his eyes fixed on its motion. Neither child looked up when their father entered. "Emma, Ethan," Javi said, in the careful, measured tone he'd been taught to use. "This is Ms. Martinez. She's going to be taking care of you while Daddy's at work." Both children continued their activities without acknowledgement. Javi felt the familiar tightness in his chest, the same helpless feeling that had haunted him for 3 years. Rosa, however, did something unexpected. She sat down on the floor between the children, but didn't try to engage with them directly. Instead, she opened her canvas bag and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "You know," she said, speaking to no one in particular, "I brought a friend with me today. His name is Frederick, and he's a mouse who lives in an old stone wall." Ethan's spinning slowed slightly. Emma's block arranging paused for just a moment. "Frederick is different from the other mice in his family. While they collect nuts and grain for winter, Frederick collects something else entirely. He collects colors and words and warm feelings." Javi watched in fascination as both children, while still engaged in their individual activities, seem to orient slightly toward Rosa's voice. The other mice think Frederick is strange. They don't understand why he spends his time gathering sunbeams and blue periwinkle days and red poppy dreams instead of doing what mice are supposed to do. Rosa's voice had a musical quality, rising and falling like a gentle tide. She wasn't performing for the children or trying to force their attention. She was simply sharing a story, as natural as breathing. But when winter comes and the stone wall becomes cold and grey, something magical happens. Frederick shares his collection of colours and words, and suddenly the other mice can see summer sunshine and feel warm spring breezes. Even in the deepest part of winter, Emma had stopped arranging blocks entirely. Ethan's top had come to a complete stop in his hands. Both children were now looking directly at Rosa, their eyes bright with attention Javi had never seen before. And that's when the other mice realized, Rosa continued, that Frederick wasn't strange at all. He was just collecting different things you can't hold in your paws, but can hold in your heart. The room was completely silent for a moment. Then Ethan did something that made Javi's breath catch. He crawled across the floor toward Rosa, still clutching his spinning top, and sat down beside her. Emma followed a moment later, bringing 3 of her perfectly arranged blocks. Rosa smiled and gently closed the book. Frederick reminds me of some very special children I know. Children who see the world in their own beautiful way and collect their own kinds of treasures. Javi stood frozen in the doorway, watching his children, his silent, unreachable children, sitting peacefully beside a woman they'd met 5 minutes ago. For the first time in 3 years, they looked content, not stimulated by technology or positioned by therapists, but simply, genuinely at peace. He cleared his throat softly. I should head to the office. Rosa, you have my number if you need anything. As he walked back through the marble halls of his house, Javi couldn't shake the image of his children's faces as they listened to the story about Frederick the Mouse. In all the months of therapy sessions and behavioral interventions, no one had thought to simply sit with them and share a story about being different, about how being different might actually be a gift. By the time he reached his Tesla in the circular driveway, Javi Green realized he was crying. Not from sadness, but from a hope he'd thought was lost forever. The hope that maybe, just maybe, someone finally understood how to speak his children's language. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The next morning arrived with Seattle's typical October drizzle, but inside the Green estate, something had shifted. Javi found himself waking up 15 minutes earlier than usual, an unfamiliar anticipation pulling him from sleep. For the first time in months, he wasn't dreading the morning routine with Emma and Ethan. He dressed quickly and made his way to the kitchen, where he expected to find Rosa already preparing the twins' precisely measured breakfast. Instead, he discovered something that stopped him in his tracks. Rosa was sitting at the large granite island, sketching in a notebook while humming softly to herself. Spread across the counter were materials he didn't recognize: colorful fabric squares, smooth river stones, small bells, and what appeared to be homemade Play-Doh in various textures. "Good morning, Mr. Green," Rosa said, looking up from her drawing. "I hope you don't mind. I brought some things from home that I thought the children might enjoy." Javi approached cautiously, his business-trained mind immediately cataloging potential safety concerns and liability issues. "What exactly are these for?" "Sensory exploration. Yesterday, I noticed that Emma responds to visual patterns and Ethan is drawn to tactile experiences. These materials offer different ways for them to express themselves beyond their usual routines." Before Javi could respond, the soft patter of small feet announced the twins' arrival. Emma appeared first, her blonde hair still messy from sleep, followed by Ethan, who was already clutching his favorite spinning top. What happened next defied 3 years of established patterns. Instead of heading straight to their designated breakfast spots, both children gravitated toward the counter where Rosa's materials were displayed. Emma's eyes widened at the sight of the fabric squares arranged in a gradient from deep purple to pale yellow. Ethan reached out tentatively toward a collection of smooth stones, each one a different weight and texture. "Good morning, Emma." "Good morning, Ethan," Rosa said gently. "I thought you might like to explore some new textures today, but first, shall we have breakfast?" To Javi's amazement, both children nodded. It was subtle, just a small dip of their chins, but it was the first time either had acknowledged a caregiver's question with any form of response. As Rosa prepared their breakfast with the same precision as previous nannies, she narrated her actions in a way that was completely different. Instead of clinical instructions, she wove stories. "Emma, your toast squares are like little golden windows, all the same size so they feel safe and predictable in your hands," she said, cutting the bread with mathematical precision. "And Ethan, your orange slices are like tiny suns, bringing warmth and sweetness to start your day." Javi watched from the doorway, mesmerized. The children ate more readily than he'd seen in weeks, their usual breakfast struggles replaced by quiet focus. After breakfast, Rosa guided them to the playroom, but instead of directing them to their usual activities, she simply sat cross-legged on the floor and opened her notebook. "Yesterday we met Frederick the mouse," she began. "Today I'd like to tell you about Frederick's friend, a little girl named Luna who lived in the same building as the mice." Emma immediately abandoned her color-sorting blocks and moved closer. Ethan set down his spinning top, something Javi had never seen him do voluntarily during story time with previous caregivers. Luna was 7 years old and she had a secret. She could hear things that other people couldn't hear, not with her ears, but with her heart. Rosa's voice took on that same musical quality from the day before, but today there was something more deliberate about it. She was watching the children's reactions, adjusting her tone and pacing based on their responses. Luna could hear the whispered dreams of sleeping flowers. She could hear the gentle conversations between raindrops as they slid down window panes. She could hear the happy humming of busy ants as they worked together. Ethan's eyes were fixed on Rosa's face with an intensity Javi had only seen when his son was watching spinning objects. Emma had unconsciously begun arranging the fabric squares Rosa had brought, but instead of her usual rigid patterns, she was creating flowing, organic shapes. But the most beautiful sound Luna could hear was the sound of kindness. Whenever someone did something caring for another person, Luna would hear a soft chiming, like tiny silver bells ringing in harmony. Rosa reached into her bag and pulled out a small set of wind chimes. She gave them the gentlest shake, producing a delicate cascade of musical notes. Both children smiled, not the polite, practiced smiles they'd been taught to produce for therapists and doctors, but genuine expressions of joy that transformed their entire faces. Luna discovered that she could share this gift with others. When she told people about the beautiful sounds she heard, they began to notice them too. The whispered dreams, the raindrop conversations, the ant songs. Suddenly, everyone could hear the magic that had always been there. Javi felt something crack open inside his chest. He realized he was witnessing more than just successful childcare. He was seeing his children come alive in a way he'd never thought possible. The rest of the morning unfolded like a carefully choreographed dance, but one that followed the children's natural rhythms rather than imposed external structure. Rosa introduced the sensory materials gradually, allowing Emma and Ethan to explore them at their own pace, while weaving stories about each texture, each color, each sound. When Emma picked up a piece of velvet fabric, Rosa told her about a rabbit named Sage, who collected the softest things in the forest to make beds for tired woodland creatures. When Ethan discovered that different stones made different sounds when tapped together, Rosa shared the tale of a young drummer who could make music from anything he touched. By mid-morning, something unprecedented was happening. Emma had begun making small vocal sounds, not words, but melodic humming that seemed to respond to Rosa's stories. Ethan had started tapping out complex rhythms on his collection of stones, creating patterns that were far more sophisticated than his usual repetitive behaviors. But the most remarkable change was in how they interacted with each other. For the first time Javi could remember, Emma and Ethan were sharing the same space comfortably, occasionally offering each other materials, or responding to each other's discoveries with gentle touches or shared glances. At 11:30, Javi's phone buzzed with an urgent message from his office. A major client was having system issues, and the entire NexTech development team was waiting for his input. Normally, he would have kissed the twins goodbye and rushed to handle the crisis, but today he found himself hesitating. "Rosa," he said, "I need to step out for a few hours. There's an emergency at the office." "Of course, Mr. Green. We'll be fine here." As he gathered his things, Javi paused at the playroom doorway one last time. Emma was now creating elaborate patterns with the fabric squares, while humming a tune that seemed to mirror Rosa's storytelling cadence. Ethan was building towers with his stones, but instead of knocking them down in frustration when they fell, he was laughing and starting over. "Rosa," Javi said quietly, "what you're doing here? I've never seen them like this." Rosa looked up from where she was sitting beside the children. "They were always like this, Mr. Green. They just needed someone who spoke their language." As Javi drove toward downtown Seattle, Rosa's words echoed in his mind. For 3 years, he'd focused on trying to bring his children into his world, the world of schedules and therapies and behavioral modifications. But Rosa was doing something entirely different. She was entering their world and inviting them to share it with her. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He'd spent millions on specialists and treatments, hired the most qualified professionals money could buy, installed every assistive technology available. But he'd never simply sat on the floor and told his children a story. He'd never learned to speak their language. For the second time in 2 days, Javi Green found himself crying in his car. But this time, the tears were mixed with something he hadn't felt in 3 years, the possibility that maybe, just maybe, he could learn to be the father his children deserved. The crisis at NexTech turned into a 14-hour marathon that kept Javi at the office until nearly midnight. By the time he returned home, the estate was quiet, with only the soft glow of landscape lighting illuminating the driveway. He expected to find Rosa long gone and the twins asleep in their beds. Following their usual rigid 8 p.m. routine, instead, he discovered something that fundamentally challenged everything he thought he knew about his children. Soft light spilled from the twins' playroom, accompanied by gentle murmurs and what sounded like giggling. Javi had never heard his children giggle before. He approached quietly, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening. Through the partially open door, he saw Rosa sitting on the floor with Emma and Ethan. But they weren't in their pajamas as the schedule dictated. Instead, they were wrapped in soft blankets, and Rosa was reading from a different book than the day before. More importantly, both children were actively participating in ways that defied their diagnoses. Emma was using her fabric squares to create visual representations of the story characters, rearranging them as the plot progressed. Ethan was providing a rhythmic soundtrack with his stones, tapping out beats that seemed to perfectly match the story's emotional cadence. And so the little star realized, Rosa was saying, that she didn't need to shine as brightly as the sun to be important. Her gentle glow was exactly what the night travelers needed to find their way home. "Like lighthouse," Ethan whispered. Javi's breath caught. Those were the first words he'd heard his son speak in over 6 months. "Yes, exactly like a lighthouse, Ethan," Rosa replied as naturally as if he'd been speaking all along. "Sometimes the most helpful light is the one that's steady and constant, not the brightest." Emma held up a piece of silver fabric, catching the lamplight. "Star fabric," she said softly. Javi gripped the doorframe. Emma was not only speaking, but making abstract connections between the story and the physical world around her. "That's perfect, Emma. That fabric does look like starlight, doesn't it?" Rosa continued the story, but now it had become interactive in a way that seemed impossible given the children's previous limitations. They were responding, contributing, building on each other's ideas. This wasn't the structured, goal-oriented therapy sessions Javi was accustomed to. This was play, pure, joyful, creative play, When the story ended, Rosa helped them transition to their bedtime routine, but even this was different. Instead of the mechanical process of teeth brushing and scheduled bathroom breaks, she turned it into a gentle continuation of their evening together. "Shall we go say goodnight to the moon?" she suggested. "I bet she's been waiting to see you." Both children nodded eagerly and padded toward their bedroom windows. Javi watched from the hallway as Rosa lifted each twin to look out at the night sky. "Look, there's our friend the moon," Rosa said. "She's been listening to our stories all evening. Can you see her smile?" "Moon happy," Emma observed, pressing her small hand against the glass. "Night moon," Ethan added, waving at the bright crescent as Rosa tucked them into their beds. She hummed the same melody Emma had been creating with her earlier humming. Both children settled into sleep faster than Javi had ever witnessed. When Rosa finally emerged from their rooms, she found Javi standing in the hallway, his expression a mixture of amazement and something that looked like grief. "Mr. Green, I didn't hear you come in. How did the crisis at work resolve?" "It's handled," he said, though work was the furthest thing from his mind. "Rosa, what I just witnessed." They were talking, having conversations, playing imaginatively. "Every specialist has told me that level of interaction isn't possible for them." Rosa studied his face carefully. "Mr. Green, may I ask you something? When the specialists assess Emma and Ethan, what kind of environment are they in?" "Clinical settings mostly. Testing rooms with standardized materials and specific protocols. And how do the children typically respond in those environments?" Javi thought back to countless appointments and evaluations. "They usually shut down, become non-responsive. The therapists say it's because of their sensory processing issues and social anxiety." "What if," Rosa said gently, "the children aren't limited by their autism? What if they're limited by environments that don't speak their language?" The question hit Javi like a revelation. "You think the problem isn't with them at all?" "I think Emma and Ethan are incredibly intelligent, creative, and emotionally complex children who process the world differently than neurotypical people expect. When we meet them in their world instead of forcing them into ours, they flourish." That night, Javi couldn't sleep. He found himself walking through his house, seeing it with new eyes. The marble floors that echoed every footstep, the stark white walls that offered no visual comfort, the high-tech gadgets that required precise manipulation, the rigid schedules posted in every room. He'd designed this environment based on what the experts told him his children needed: structure, routine, minimal sensory input. But what if he'd created a prison instead of a sanctuary? The next morning, Javi made a decision that would have been unthinkable a week earlier. He called his assistant and cleared his entire schedule. "Sir?" Patricia sounded confused. "You have the Morrison Industries presentation this afternoon and the board meeting at 4. Reschedule everything. I'm taking a personal day." When Rosa arrived at 7 a.m., she found Javi in the kitchen, attempting to recreate the previous day's breakfast routine. "I want to learn," he said simply. "I want to understand what you're doing with them," Rosa smiled. "The most important thing is to follow their lead instead of trying to direct them. Watch." As the twins appeared for breakfast, Rosa didn't immediately launch into storytelling. Instead, she observed, Emma moved slowly, touching the wall as she walked, a self-soothing behavior Javi had always tried to discourage. Ethan was humming under his breath the same melody from the night before. Emma's using the wall to help her nervous system wake up, Rosa explained quietly. And Ethan's humming is his way of organizing his thoughts for the day. These aren't behaviors to correct, they're communication. Rosa approached Emma gently. "Good morning, Emma. I see you're visiting with the wall. Is it helping you feel ready for the day?" Emma paused, her hand trailing, and looked at Rosa with those bright blue eyes. "Wall smooth, like calm, I understand. Sometimes we need smooth, calm things to help us feel centered." She turned to Ethan, who was still humming. "That's a beautiful song, Ethan. It reminds me of morning birds." "Birds wake up happy," Ethan replied, his humming growing slightly louder with confidence. Javi watched this exchange with growing understanding. Rosa wasn't ignoring the children's behaviors or trying to modify them. She was acknowledging them, validating them, and using them as starting points for connection. "May I try?" he asked hesitantly. Rosa nodded encouragingly. Javi approached his children with tentative steps. "Emma, Ethan, good morning." Both children looked at him with mild surprise. Their father never spoke to them before breakfast was prepared and served. "Ethan, I heard your morning song. It's very nice." Ethan's humming stopped abruptly, and for a moment, Javi feared he'd made a mistake. Then his son did something extraordinary. He walked over to his father and began humming directly to him. "A private performance just for Javi or Emma?" Not to be outdone, approached and took Javi's hand, guiding it to touch the wall she'd been trailing along. "Feel," she said simply. Javi ran his palm along the smooth surface, understanding for the first time that this wasn't a compulsive behavior. It was Emma sharing something that brought her comfort. "It is smooth," he said, wonder in his voice. "Thank you for showing me, Emma." Both children beamed at him with genuine joy, and in that moment, Javi Green realized that everything was about to change. He was ready to learn his children's language, even if it meant unlearning everything he thought he knew about being their father. 3 weeks into Rosa's employment, the Green household had transformed in ways that seemed almost magical to outsiders, but felt completely natural to those living within it. Emma had begun creating elaborate fabric art installations throughout the house, turning mundane spaces into galleries of color and texture. Ethan had developed a complex musical language using household objects, composing symphonies with kitchen utensils, stone collections, and anything that could produce sound. But success, Javi was learning, brought its own complications. Dr. Margaret Holloway, the children's behavioral therapist for the past 2 years, arrived for her weekly session on a Tuesday morning to find Emma and Ethan engaged in activities that directly contradicted her treatment protocols. Instead of sitting at designated workstations completing structured tasks, they were sprawled on the living room floor with Rosa, building an elaborate cityscape using blocks, fabric, and natural materials. "Mr. Green," Dr. Holloway said, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to having her expertise unquestioned, "I need to speak with you privately." Javi reluctantly followed her to his home office, leaving Rosa to continue the activity with the twins. Through the glass doors, he could see Emma explaining her fabric bridge design to Ethan, who was adding rhythmic sound effects to represent the cars crossing over. "I'm concerned about the lack of structure I'm observing," Dr. Holloway began, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Emma and Ethan have made significant progress with our behavioral intervention program over the past 2 years. What I'm seeing today represents a complete departure from evidence-based practices. They seem happy," Javi said carefully, "more engaged than I've ever seen them. Happiness isn't the goal, Mr. Green. Functional life skills are the goal. These children need to learn to operate in the real world, not in a fantasy environment that caters to their impulses." Dr. Holloway opened her tablet and pulled up the twins' treatment plans. Emma should be working on following multi-step instructions and reducing her dependence on repetitive behaviors. Instead, I see her engaging in elaborate pattern making that reinforces her need for visual stimulation. Ethan should be practicing appropriate social responses and decreasing his fixation on auditory input. Instead, he's being encouraged to make noise. Javi felt a familiar tension building in his shoulders. For 3 weeks, he'd watched his children blossom in ways he'd never thought possible. Now the expert he'd trusted was telling him it was all wrong. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm recommending we return to the established protocol immediately. Ms. Martinez, while well-intentioned, lacks the training to properly address your children's needs. I can provide you with a list of qualified behavioral technicians who understand autism spectrum disorders." That afternoon, after Dr. Holloway left with promises to review the treatment plan, Javi found himself torn between the progress he'd witnessed and the professional advice he'd been following for years. The doubt crept in slowly, like a fog rolling off Elliott Bay. What if Rosa's approach was actually harmful in the long run? What if he was setting his children up for failure by allowing them to live in a world that didn't exist outside these walls? What if Dr. Holloway was right and functional skills mattered more than happiness? The internal conflict came to a head 2 days later when Javi's brother Marcus visited from Portland. Marcus Green was everything Javi wasn't. A pediatric surgeon who approached problems with clinical precision, a father of 3 neurotypical children who excelled in traditional academic settings, and someone who'd never hesitated to share his opinions about Javi's experimental parenting approaches. "This is interesting," Marcus said, watching Emma create an intricate mandala pattern with colored stones, while Ethan provided a percussive soundtrack. "Very artistic. But what are they learning that will help them function independently?" "They're learning to communicate," Javi replied, but even as he said it, he could hear the defensiveness in his voice. "Communication is great, but can Emma follow instructions in a classroom setting? Can Ethan handle unexpected schedule changes without a meltdown? These are the skills that matter for their future." Marcus picked up one of Ethan's rhythm stones, examining it like a medical specimen. "You know, there's an excellent residential program in Colorado that specializes in intensive behavioral modification for children with severe autism. The success rates are impressive." "Residential program?" Javi's blood chilled. "You mean sending them away?" "Just temporarily. 6 months to a year of intensive intervention could give them the foundation they need to succeed in mainstream environments. It's something to consider before they get too set in these patterns." That evening, after Marcus left, Javi sat in his office, staring at the website for the Colorado facility. The testimonials were compelling, full of stories about children who'd learned to navigate neurotypical environments successfully. The before and after videos showed dramatic behavioral changes, but as he watched the after videos, something nagged at him. The children looked compliant, functional, but somehow dimmed. They followed instructions perfectly, sat quietly, made appropriate eye contact, but their eyes lacked the spark he'd grown to love in Emma and Ethan's faces. Rosa found him there at midnight, still scrolling through treatment options and second-guessing everything. "Mr. Green, I saw the light on. Is everything all right?" Javi looked up, exhaustion evident in his face. "Rosa, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Are we doing the right thing? Everyone with professional credentials is telling me that your approach, while beautiful, isn't preparing them for the real world." Rosa sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful. "What do you think the real world looks like for Emma and Ethan?" "I don't know anymore. Dr. Holloway says they need to learn to function in typical environments. My brother thinks they need intensive behavioral modification. The internet is full of programs that promise to make them normal. And what do you want for them?" The question hung in the air. Javi realized he'd spent so much time listening to experts that he'd never really asked himself what he hoped for his children's future. "I want them to be happy," he said finally. "I want them to feel understood and valued for who they are. I want them to have relationships and purpose and joy. Those are beautiful goals. Now let me ask you this. In the past 3 weeks, have you seen Emma and Ethan moving toward or away from those things?" Javi thought about Emma's growing confidence in expressing her ideas, about Ethan's willingness to share his musical discoveries, about the way both children had begun seeking out interaction rather than retreating from it. "Toward," he admitted. "The real world isn't one size fits all. Mr. Green, there are communities of artists, musicians, inventors, and creators who value different ways of thinking. There are workplaces that need people who see patterns others miss, who hear rhythms others can't detect, who create beauty from unexpected materials." Rosa pulled out her phone and showed him a video of a young man with autism who'd become a successful textile artist. His repetitive behaviors channeled into intricate weavings that sold in galleries worldwide. "This is Miguel's friend from our support group," she said. 20 years ago, therapists tried to stop his obsessive weaving behaviors. His mother finally said no. Today, his art supports him and brings joy to thousands of people, She scrolled to another video. A woman with autism who'd become a renowned percussionist. Her sensitivity to sound transformed into musical genius. The question isn't whether Emma and Ethan can learn to fit into a world that doesn't understand them. The question is whether we can help them build skills to create a world where they can thrive as themselves. As Javi watched these success stories, he felt something shift inside him. These weren't people who'd been forced to abandon their autistic traits. They were people who'd been supported in developing those traits into strengths. But what about basic life skills? Independence? The practical things they'll need? We'll teach those too, but in ways that build on their strengths rather than fighting against them. Emma's pattern recognition can help her learn organization and planning. Ethan's musical abilities can help him understand mathematical concepts and social rhythms. We'll prepare them for the world, but we won't dim their light to do it. That night, Javi made a decision that would change everything. He cancelled Dr. Holloway's future appointments and called the school district to request an evaluation for alternative educational approaches. He wouldn't send his children away to be fixed. Instead, he would help them build a world where being different was a gift, not a diagnosis to overcome. But he had no idea that the real test of his commitment was still to come. The crisis began with a phone call that Javi would replay in his mind for weeks afterward. It was 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday when Rosa's voice came through his office speaker, strained in a way he'd never heard before. "Mr. Green, I need you to come home immediately. There's been an incident." Javi's heart hammered as he raced through Seattle traffic, his mind conjuring worst-case scenarios. When he burst through the front door 23 minutes later, he found Rosa sitting on the living room couch with Emma curled in her lap, both children unusually quiet. "What happened?" he demanded, his eyes scanning for signs of injury or distress. "The new educational specialist arrived for the evaluation," Rosa began carefully. "Mrs. Patterson from the school district. She brought standardized assessment materials and wanted to conduct formal testing." Javi's stomach sank. He'd requested the evaluation as an alternative to Dr. Holloway's approach, hoping for more individualized educational planning. And Emma and Ethan shut down completely. When Mrs. Patterson tried to redirect Emma from her fabric work to complete puzzles at a desk, Emma had her first meltdown in 3 weeks. Ethan stopped speaking entirely and began hitting himself when asked to suppress his humming during the quiet assessment period. The words hit Javi like physical blows, self-harm, meltdowns, all. The behaviors that had virtually disappeared under Rosa's care had returned in a single afternoon. "Where's Mrs. Patterson now?" "She left 30 minutes ago. She said—" Rosa paused, choosing her words carefully. "She said the children showed significant behavioral regression and recommended immediate return to intensive behavioral intervention. She's filing a report suggesting that the current care approach is detrimental to their development." Javi sank into a chair, the weight of the situation crushing down on him. In trying to advocate for his children, he'd triggered an official review that could potentially result in state intervention. "There's more," Rosa continued gently. "Mrs. Patterson documented everything. The unconventional educational materials, the lack of structured therapy compliance, what she called enabling behaviors rather than skill building. She's recommending a full psychological evaluation to determine if alternative placement might be necessary." The phrase alternative placement sent ice through Javi's veins. In Washington state, if educational and therapeutic professionals deemed a home environment unsuitable for children with special needs, the state could intervene. Foster care, residential facilities, the very outcomes he'd been trying to avoid. That evening, after the twins were finally asleep, Javi sat in his study reviewing the official documentation Mrs. Patterson had left behind. Her report painted a damning picture of children whose maladaptive behaviors were being reinforced through inappropriate therapeutic approaches. She'd recommended immediate enrollment in a specialized school with intensive behavioral programming, and warned that continued indulgence of autistic behaviors could result in permanent inability to function in society. The photographs she'd taken were particularly devastating. Emma mid-meltdown, her face red and tear-streaked. Ethan, with his hands over his ears, rocking in a corner. Rosa attempting to comfort them, while assessment materials lay scattered and ignored. To someone who hadn't witnessed the past month's progress, it looked like chaos. Like failed parenting and misguided care. Javi's phone rang at 11 p.m. Marcus's name appeared on the screen. "I heard about today," his brother said without preamble. "The Patterson woman called Dr. Holloway, who called me. Javi, this is serious. You're looking at potential state intervention if you don't course correct immediately. The children were thriving before today." Were they? Or were they just being indulged? "Look, I've arranged for an emergency consultation with the Colorado facility I mentioned. They can take Emma and Ethan next week if we act fast. It's the best way to demonstrate to the state that you're taking appropriate action." "Absolutely not. Javi, listen to me. I've seen the Patterson report. The state considers Rosa unqualified and her methods potentially harmful. If you don't voluntarily seek proper treatment, they'll mandate it. At least with Colorado, you maintained some control over the situation." After Marcus hung up, Javi found himself standing in the twins' doorway, watching them sleep peacefully in beds surrounded by Emma's fabric creations and Ethan's carefully arranged stone collections. In sleep, they looked like any other 5-year-olds, innocent and trusting that the adults in their lives would protect them. But he was failing to protect them. His decision to reject conventional treatment had backfired spectacularly, potentially putting them at risk of being removed from his care entirely. The next morning brought another devastating blow. Patricia called to inform him that NexTech's board of directors had received an anonymous tip about his family situation and were requesting a meeting to discuss whether personal issues were affecting his leadership capabilities. "Sir, the concern is that negative publicity around child welfare investigations could impact the company's reputation and upcoming IPO," Patricia explained delicately. Javi realized with sickening clarity that someone was systematically dismantling everything he'd built, both personally and professionally. The timing was too convenient, the information too detailed to be coincidental. When Rosa arrived that morning, she found Javi in the kitchen, staring at resignation letters, one from NexTech's board, one from the Colorado facility accepting Emma and Ethan for immediate enrollment. "Mr. Green, I think I've made a terrible mistake," he said quietly. "I let my emotions override professional judgment, and now my children are going to pay the price." Rosa sat beside him at the granite island. "What's happened?" Javi explained about the board meeting, the threat of state intervention, Marcus's ultimatum. "Maybe everyone's right. Maybe I'm being selfish, keeping them here when they could get proper treatment elsewhere." "And you believe that?" "I don't know what I believe anymore. All I know is that yesterday, for the first time in weeks, my children were in pain. Real devastating pain. Mrs. Patterson said they showed signs of severe behavioral dysfunction. What if I've been fooling myself? What if their happiness here isn't worth anything if they can't function anywhere else?" Rosa was quiet for a long moment. "Mr. Green, may I share something with you?" At his nod, she continued. "When Miguel was 12, our school district insisted he needed residential placement. They said our family was enabling his dysfunction, that he needed intensive intervention to have any chance of independence. My parents, exhausted and scared, almost agreed. What stopped them? Miguel did. The night before he was supposed to leave, he arranged his toy cars in a pattern I'd never seen before. It took me hours to understand what he was trying to tell me." Rosa's eyes filled with tears. "He'd created a map of our house, with his car representing himself. But in every room his car was alone. He was showing me what residential placement felt like to him, being completely isolated from everything and everyone he loved." "What did your parents do?" "They canceled the placement. Instead, they found ways to advocate within the system while protecting Miguel's essence. It wasn't easy. There were investigations, evaluations, constant scrutiny. But Miguel stayed home, stayed himself, and eventually the world began to catch up to what we'd always known, that different doesn't mean broken. Rosa reached across the table and gently touched Javi's hand. Emma and Ethan weren't in pain yesterday because of anything you've done wrong. They were in pain because someone tried to force them back into a box they'd finally escaped from. The question is, will you let the system convince you that the box is where they belong, or will you fight for their right to be themselves? As Rosa's words sank in, Javi felt something harden inside him. His children weren't the problem. The system that couldn't see their value was the problem. And if he had to choose between protecting them and pleasing professionals who'd never bothered to truly understand them, there was really no choice at all. But standing up to an entire system would require more courage than he'd ever needed before, and he wasn't sure he had enough strength left to fight a battle that seemed impossible to win. The breakthrough came at 3:17 a.m. on a sleepless Saturday night, not through revelation or inspiration, but through the simple act of watching his children sleep. Javi had been pacing the house for hours, the Colorado facility's enrollment papers clutched in his hand, when he heard soft whispers coming from Emma's room. Peering through the cracked door, he discovered both twins sitting cross-legged on Emma's bed in their pajamas, engaged in quiet conversation. Ethan scared, Emma was saying, her small hands arranging glow-in-the-dark stars on her comforter in deliberate patterns. "New people loud," Ethan replied, tapping out a gentle rhythm on his knees. "Make Emma cry today." "Don't want to go away," Emma continued, adding more stars to her constellation. "Rosa tells good stories. Daddy learning our language." Javi's breath caught. They understood. Somehow, his 5-year-old children grasped that their world was under threat, that the adults around them were making decisions about their future. "We make Daddy sad," Ethan observed, his tapping growing more complex, almost musical. "No," Emma said firmly, reaching over to still her brother's hands. "Daddy loves us. Other people don't understand star language." "Star language?" Ethan tilted his head, curious. Emma held up one of her glow-in-the-dark stars. "We talk different, like stars talk to moon with light. Other people only hear sun talking." In that moment, Javi realized his daughter had just articulated something that dozens of professionals had failed to grasp. She understood that she and Ethan communicated differently, not deficiently. They had their own language, visual, musical, tactile, that was just as valid as spoken words. "We stay together?" Ethan asked, crawling closer to his sister. "Always together," Emma confirmed, creating a pattern with her stars that somehow resembled two small figures holding hands. Javi quietly backed away from the door, his heart pounding with a clarity he hadn't felt in days. His children weren't broken or lacking. They were speaking a different language that most adults had simply never bothered to learn. That Sunday morning, instead of driving to the NexTech offices to submit his resignation, Javi made a different choice. He called an emergency family meeting, not with therapists or specialists, but with the 3 people who mattered most: Rosa, Emma, and Ethan. "I want to apologize," he began, sitting on the living room floor where the twins were most comfortable. "This week, I let other people's fears make me forget what I'd learned about you both." Emma looked up from the fabric mandala she was creating. Ethan paused, his morning rhythm making with his stone collection. "I want to ask you something," Javi continued, "and I want you to answer in whatever way feels right to you. Do you want to stay here with Rosa and me, even if it means some people won't understand us?" Emma immediately began rearranging her fabric pieces into a clear pattern, a house shape with 3 figures inside. Ethan crawled over and placed one of his smooth stones in the center of Emma's fabric house, then looked directly at his father and nodded. "Okay," Javi said, his voice thick with emotion. "Then we're going to fight for that." Rosa, who had been watching quietly from the corner, smiled through her tears. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to help me document everything. every breakthrough, every moment of joy, every skill they're developing. If the system wants evidence, we'll give them evidence, but evidence of growth, not compliance. Over the next week, Javi embarked on the most important project of his life. Using his tech expertise, he created a comprehensive documentation system that captured the twins' real progress in ways that traditional assessments had missed. He filmed Emma teaching him her fabric pattern language, showing how she could communicate complex emotions and ideas through color and arrangement. He recorded Ethan's musical compositions, demonstrating how his son could express mathematical concepts, storytelling, and emotional states through rhythm and sound. But more importantly, he began documenting their life skills development. Emma, organizing her art supplies, showed planning and categorization abilities. Ethan, helping Rosa prepare breakfast while maintaining his musical narration, demonstrated following multi-step instructions and social cooperation. The most powerful documentation came when Javi filmed himself learning their languages. The camera captured his fumbling attempts to understand Emma's visual communication style, his growing ability to interpret Ethan's rhythmic expressions, and most importantly, the joy on his children's faces as their father finally began to understand them. "Look," he said to Rosa as they reviewed the footage one evening, "every professional has been measuring them against neurotypical standards. But what if we measure their growth against their own baseline? What if we show how much they've developed when allowed to flourish as themselves?" Rosa nodded enthusiastically. "It's not about making them normal. It's about helping them become the best versions of themselves." Javi's next step required more courage than any business decision he'd ever made. He called Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a renowned autism researcher at the University of Washington whose work focused on neurodiversity and alternative assessment methods. "Dr. Hendricks, I'm Javi Green. I'm reaching out because I need help advocating for my children, and I believe your research aligns with what we're experiencing." Dr. Hendricks agreed to visit the following Tuesday. Unlike Mrs. Patterson's formal assessment, this visit felt collaborative from the moment she arrived. She spent the morning simply observing the twins in their natural environment, taking notes not on deficits but on capabilities. "Remarkable," she murmured, as she watched Emma create a three-dimensional story using fabric, blocks, and natural materials while narrating the plot to Ethan, who provided musical accompaniment that perfectly matched the emotional beats of the tale. They're collaborating on a complex narrative. Dr. Hendricks explained to Javi, "Emma is demonstrating advanced spatial reasoning, sequential thinking, and abstract storytelling. Ethan is showing sophisticated pattern recognition, emotional interpretation, and musical composition skills. This level of cooperative creativity is extraordinary for any 5-year-old, neurotypical or otherwise." More importantly, Dr. Hendricks understood the broader implications of what she was witnessing. "Mr. Green, what you're documenting here challenges fundamental assumptions about autism and education. These children aren't failing to learn. They're learning in ways our systems haven't recognized as valid." That afternoon, Dr. Hendricks made a call that would change everything. As the director of the UW Neurodiversity Research Institute, she had connections throughout the state's educational and therapeutic communities. "I'm recommending Emma and Ethan Green for our pilot program in alternative educational assessment," she told the state education coordinator. "Their case represents exactly the kind of innovative approach we need to be studying and supporting." When Javi received the call that the state was dropping its intervention review and instead requesting documentation of his family's approach for potential replication in other cases, he felt something he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. Absolute, unshakable certainty that he was exactly where he needed to be. But the most profound transformation wasn't professional or legal. It was personal. That evening, as Javi sat with Emma and Ethan for their nightly storytelling session, he realized he was no longer translating between their world and his. He was simply living in a world they'd built together, where different languages of love and communication not only coexisted, but created something beautiful. "Tell us the daddy story," Emma requested, settling against his shoulder with her favorite star-patterned fabric. "The daddy story." Javi was confused. "About daddy learning to hear music and see colors," Ethan clarified, beginning a soft rhythm with his fingers on Javi's arm. And as Javi began to tell the story of a father who discovered that love wasn't about changing the people you care about, but about growing big enough to embrace all the ways they shine, he realized that his children had been teaching him all along. The transformation was complete. He wasn't just Emma and Ethan's father anymore. He was a student of their unique brilliance, and for the first time in years, he was exactly who he wanted to be. The ultimate test of everything Javi had learned came 6 weeks later in the most unlikely of places, the NexTech Solutions annual board meeting, where 50 of the tech industry's most influential leaders had gathered to decide the company's future. What they didn't expect was for the CEO to bring his 5-year-old twins as his co-presenters. "Gentlemen, ladies," Javi began, standing before the polished conference table where he'd made countless presentations over the years. "6 months ago, you hired me to revolutionize how technology connects people. Today, I want to show you how 2 remarkable individuals taught me what real connection actually means." Emma and Ethan sat cross-legged on a specially designed presentation mat in the center of the room, surrounded by carefully arranged materials that looked nothing like typical corporate presentation tools. Emma had her collection of fabric squares, natural stones, and color-coded organizational systems. Ethan had his rhythm instruments, sound-making devices, and spatial puzzle materials. Board member Patricia Williamson shifted uncomfortably in her seat. "Javi, we appreciate your family situation, but this is hardly the appropriate venue for—" "Please," Javi interrupted gently. "Give me 15 minutes. If what you see doesn't fundamentally change how you think about human potential and technological innovation, I'll submit my resignation immediately." The room fell silent except for the soft sounds of Emma arranging her materials and Ethan testing different rhythmic patterns. "3 months ago, I thought my children were limited by their autism. Today, I understand that I was limited by my narrow definition of intelligence, communication, and capability." "Emma, would you show us the city project?" Emma looked up at the intimidating room full of adults, then at her father. Something passed between them, not words, but understanding. She began creating an intricate layout using her fabric squares, stones, and small wooden blocks. "Emma is designing a smart city infrastructure," Javi explained, as his daughter worked with focused intensity. "But she's not using traditional architectural software or engineering principles. She's using pattern recognition, color coding for different urban systems, and spatial relationships that account for sensory-friendly design." The board members leaned forward, despite themselves, as Emma's creation took shape. What emerged wasn't just a city layout. It was a revolutionary approach to urban planning that prioritized accessibility, visual clarity, and human comfort in ways that traditional city designs had never considered. "The blue fabric represents water systems," Javi continued, following Emma's gestural explanations. "Notice how she's created multiple small water features throughout residential areas rather than centralized reservoirs. The purple stones indicate quiet zones, spaces designed for people who need reduced sensory input. The wooden blocks show transportation hubs, but see how they're connected by gentle curves rather than sharp intersections." Board member David Chen, himself a father of 3, spoke up. "This is remarkable. She's solving urban planning problems that our best city designers struggle with." "Now, Ethan," Javi said, "would you add the communication systems?" Ethan began placing his various instruments and sound makers throughout Emma's city layout. But this wasn't random placement. He was creating an acoustic map, demonstrating how different areas would sound and how information could be transmitted through varied auditory channels. "Ethan is designing the city's communication infrastructure," Javi explained, Soft chimes for emergency systems in residential areas, rhythmic patterns for transportation timing, musical bridges between different urban zones. He's creating a city that speaks to people through multiple sensory channels, not just visual screens and written text. As the twins worked together, something magical happened. Emma began incorporating Ethan's sound mapping into her visual design, creating acoustic-friendly spaces. Ethan started responding to Emma's color patterns, using different instruments for different urban zones. They were collaborating in real time, solving complex design problems through their combined, unique perspectives. "Gentlemen, ladies," Javi said, his voice carrying new authority, "what you're witnessing is the future of human-centered design. My children aren't disabled, they're differently enabled. And the technology we create should serve all kinds of minds, not just neurotypical ones." He walked to the digital presentation screen and pulled up the software interface that NexTech had been developing for smart city management. Our current platform requires users to navigate 17 different menu systems, process information through text-heavy interfaces, and adapt to communication systems designed for a single type of cognitive processing. What if instead we designed technology that worked the way all minds work, through multiple channels, flexible communication styles, and personalized interfaces? The presentation that followed was unlike anything the board had ever seen. Javi demonstrated how Emma's visual pattern recognition could revolutionize data visualization, making complex information accessible to users with different learning styles. He showed how Ethan's musical intelligence could transform user interface design, creating systems that communicated through rhythm, tone, and spatial audio cues. "This isn't just about accessibility compliance," Javi continued, his passion evident. "This is about expanding our definition of human potential. Every innovation in this room came from someone who thought differently, who saw patterns others missed, who heard solutions in the silence between conventional approaches." Board member Sarah Mitchell, who had been skeptical at the beginning, raised her hand. "You're suggesting we completely redesign our human-computer interaction principles?" "I'm suggesting we finally design technology that recognizes the full spectrum of human intelligence," Javi replied. "Emma and Ethan aren't anomalies to be accommodated. They're advanced scouts showing us how to create truly universal design." The twins had finished their collaborative city and were now sitting quietly, Emma organizing her materials in precise patterns while Ethan created a soft, rhythmic soundtrack that seemed to represent the gentle hum of their designed urban space. "Patricia." Williamson stood up and approached the children's workspace. "May I?" she asked, gesturing toward Emma's creation. Emma nodded and began explaining her design through gesture and movement, with Ethan providing sonic interpretation of different city zones. Patricia found herself genuinely engaged, asking questions through pointing and receiving remarkably clear responses through the twins' combined communication methods. "This is extraordinary," she admitted, returning to her seat. "They're not just designing cities, they're reimagining how humans interact with complex systems." The formal vote was unanimous. NexTech would pivot toward neurodiversity-informed design principles, with Emma and Ethan serving as official consultants on the new product development team. But the real victory came when board member David Chen approached Javi after the meeting. "My youngest son was diagnosed with ADHD last year," he said quietly. "The school wants to medicate him, says he can't focus properly. But watching your children today, maybe the problem isn't that he can't focus. Maybe the problem is that we're giving him the wrong things to focus on." As they packed up the presentation materials, Emma tugged on Javi's sleeve and pointed to the large windows overlooking Seattle's skyline. "Real City needs Emma and Ethan ideas," she said clearly, her words carrying more confidence than Javi had ever heard from her. "Yes," he agreed, kneeling down to her level. "Real cities need Emma and Ethan ideas. And now they're going to get them. That evening, as Rosa helped the twins wind down from their extraordinary day, Javi stood in his office looking out at the city lights and realized that everything had changed. 6 months ago, he'd been a successful businessman trying to fix his broken children. Today, he was a father whose children had just revolutionized his entire industry. The final push hadn't been about proving that Emma and Ethan could succeed in the world as it was. It had been about demonstrating that the world needed to evolve, to embrace all the ways human minds could contribute to its improvement. And tomorrow, that evolution would begin in earnest. 1 year later, the security cameras at the Green estate captured a very different kind of moment at 6:47 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. This time, they recorded Javi Green sitting cross-legged on his living room floor, surrounded by visiting families from across the country, all watching Emma and Ethan lead a workshop on what they called heart-language communication. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but its effects had rippled far beyond anything Javi could have imagined. The NexTech Neurodiversity Initiative had revolutionized the tech industry's approach to inclusive design. Emma's visual communication principles had been integrated into software used by millions, making complex information accessible to users with different cognitive processing styles. Ethan's musical interface designs had created breakthrough applications for people with various learning differences, turning technology from a barrier into a bridge. But the real magic was happening in the living room, where 12 families had gathered for what Rosa now called language exchange weekends. Every person has their own heart language, Emma was explaining to a group of parents and children, her voice clear and confident as she arranged fabric squares in demonstrative patterns. Some people speak with colors and shapes. Some people speak with sounds and rhythms. Some people speak with movements and touches. 6-year-old Marcus Chen, David's son, who had been struggling in traditional school settings, was sitting beside Ethan, learning to translate his hyperactive energy into rhythmic communication. Instead of being medicated for his inability to sit still, Marcus was discovering that his need for movement was actually a sophisticated form of information processing. See, Marcus makes thinking music with his whole body, Ethan observed, tapping along with the boy's unconscious leg bouncing. His body knows things before his words do. In the corner, Dr. Patricia Hendricks was documenting everything for her research on alternative communication methods. Her pilot program had expanded to include 15 schools across Washington state, all implementing Rosa's storytelling-based learning approaches. What we're witnessing, she explained to the visiting parents, is a fundamental shift from deficit-based thinking to strength-based recognition. These children aren't learning to overcome their differences, they're learning to leverage them as cognitive advantages. Rosa moved through the group like a conductor orchestrating a symphony, helping each family discover their unique communication patterns. She was no longer just the Greens' caregiver. She'd become the director of the newly established Northwest Center for Neurodiversity Studies, a position that allowed her to share Miguel's legacy with hundreds of families. Mrs. Patterson was right about one thing, Rosa said to the gathered parents. Structure is important for children with autism, but the structure needs to support their natural abilities, not suppress them. The woman who had once threatened to remove Emma and Ethan from their home was now one of Rosa's most enthusiastic converts, having completely revised her assessment protocols after witnessing the twins' continued growth. As the afternoon workshop concluded, Javi found himself in conversation with Dr. Michael Torres, a neuroscientist from Stanford who had driven up specifically to observe Emma and Ethan's teaching methods. Mr. Green, I've studied cognitive development for 20 years, and I've never seen anything like what your children accomplish, Dr. Torres said. They're not just communicating across neurological differences, they're creating new pathways for human connection that didn't exist before. They're not doing anything new, Javi replied, watching Emma help a shy 8-year-old girl discover her own visual communication style. They're just being themselves. We're the ones who had to learn how to recognize their gifts. The evening's most powerful moment came during dinner, when the families shared stories of their journeys toward acceptance and understanding. Maria Santos, whose twin boys had been labeled severely autistic and recommended for institutionalization, spoke through tears about how her sons were now thriving in a specialized program modeled after Rosa's approach. 6 months ago, I thought my children would never be independent, she said. Today, they're teaching other families how to communicate with love instead of fear. 8-year-old Timothy Walsh, who had been considered non-verbal until his family attended their first language exchange weekend, stood up to address the group. His communication method was unique. He drew pictures in real time while speaking, creating visual representations of his thoughts. Before I met Emma and Ethan, I thought I was broken, he said, sketching as he talked. Now I know I'm just speaking a different language, and my language is important too. The room fell silent as Timothy held up his drawing, a tree with many different colored branches, each representing a different way of communicating, all growing from the same strong roots of love and understanding. Later that evening, after the visiting families had departed for their hotels, Javi found himself in the twins' room for their nightly story time. But tonight, Emma and Ethan had a surprise for him. We wrote a story for you. Daddy, Emma announced, pulling out a handmade book filled with her fabric collages and Ethan's musical notations. It's called The Father Who Learned to Listen, Ethan added, settling against Javi's shoulder with practiced ease as they took turns reading their creation, Emma narrating while Ethan provided sound effects. Javi realized he was hearing the story of his own transformation, told through his children's eyes. In their version, he wasn't the hero who saved them. Instead, he was a character who discovered that love meant learning someone else's language rather than insisting they learn yours. And the father realized, Emma read from her carefully constructed pages, that his children were never broken. They were just teaching him how to see with different eyes and hear with his heart. The end, Ethan concluded, but then added with a grin, but also the beginning, because learning never stops. As Javi tucked his children into their beds now surrounded by the creative works of dozens of young visitors who had found their voices through Emma and Ethan's guidance, he reflected on how completely his world had changed. The Green Foundation, established with a significant portion of NexTech's profits, now funded neurodiversity research and family support programs across the country. The house that had once felt like a sterile museum had become a warm gathering place where different minds came together to celebrate their unique contributions to the world. But the most profound change was in Javi himself. The driven businessman who had once measured success in quarterly earnings and market dominance now measured it in the number of children who discovered their own voices, the families who learned to communicate across neurological differences, and the communities that expanded their definitions of human potential. Standing in his doorway one last time, watching Emma arrange her newest fabric creation while Ethan composed a gentle goodnight song, Javi remembered the man who had stood in this same spot a year ago, feeling helpless and disconnected from his own children. That man had thought his children needed to be fixed. This man understood that they had actually come to fix a world that had forgotten how to listen. The security cameras captured him walking down the hall toward his own bedroom, but they couldn't capture the most important change of all. Javi Green was no longer a billionaire who happened to have autistic children. He was a father whose children happened to be changing the world, one heart-language conversation at a time, and in the morning there would be new families arriving, new children ready to discover their own unique ways of speaking love into existence, and new opportunities to prove that different had always been another word for gift. The story that began with a man crying in his hallway had become a movement that would ripple forward for generations. carried by children who had never forgotten that the most important communication happens when we learn to listen with more than just our ears. The transformation was complete, but the real work, the joyful work of helping others find their voices, was just beginning. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.